Hey, MMT followers, Christina Fugis with MoldMaking Technology, and I am back for another MMT chat. My guest today is Michael Guckes, who is the Chief Economist for Gardner Intelligence. Hello, Michael.
Hey, Christina, good day. How are you?
Good. So Michael is back to break down the latest mold making index, which is a bit different from the expansion that we've been reporting the past or the previous 3 months. So Michael, tell us a little bit about the current index.
So, Christina, for October, the mold making index registered 53.4. So, what that tells us is that a growing proportion of mold makers and those in the molding community are seeing improving business conditions. If we go back in time, we can see that this reading is pretty similar to those we saw back in the first half of 2019, as we were coming off one of the longest expansions in recorded history. So this is a really encouraging number for the month, especially since we're entering the fourth quarter of 2020. And, this could be really great news coming into not only the end of this year, but also helping us to get a good start on 2021.
All right. So Michael, can you explain exactly what you saw with production and new orders and what it means?
Absolutely. So what we saw in the last couple of months is that production and new orders both expanded. What that means is that we're seeing a growing proportion of mold makers and mold builders tell us that not only are they getting a growing number of new orders each month, but they're also able to keep pace with that. And so, of course, what you're seeing here, this is the history of new orders and production. You can see how closely these two things move together.
Yeah.
That's really encouraging, especially now because of the issues that we've had with the supply chains this year, just across the board in manufacturing. But this tells us from the data that production has been able, for the most part, to keep up with those new orders. So that's really great news.
All right. So this month's report shows slowing expansionary activity, in your words. So can you explain how the increase in the supplier deliveries reading signals a slowing in upstream good deliveries, which could stymie production activity in the coming months? So in other words, how does that component of the index impact the overall index and the remainder of 2020?
So, Christina, when we look at the relationship between production activity and supplier deliveries activity, these two things have a really important relationship. Because if you look at the data, for example, in 2017 and 2018, what we saw in both of those cases was an acceleration in production activity, right? But then following that, not far behind, was also an increase in the supplier deliveries reading. And what it told us during those instances was that not only was production accelerating, but the upstream demand for materials, for other input goods, was also increasing to the point where those upstream suppliers had growing backlogs. And when they have growing backlogs, it means that it takes longer for that order to fulfillment period to take place. And that's how we measure this. We're measuring supplier deliveries in terms of the order to fulfillment length. And so what we see is, historically speaking, when you have a big ramp up in production, you have backlogs growing in the upstream supply chain, and then that lengthens that time period we've just talked about, and that's what we're measuring here. So when you've got these big ramp ups in supplier deliveries, like we're seeing here in 2020, the concern for us is one of, well, if those order to fulfillment periods are very long, how's that going to impact production? How does it essentially slow it down? And that's our concern is that if we can't get supplier deliveries under control, then it hamstrings production. And right now in the fourth quarter, of course, we have all that seasonal demand on shippers, right? We've seen it classically year after year. It takes forever for us to get things through the supply chains, in part just because the trucks can't move fast enough. And that's my concern going into the fourth quarter.
That totally makes sense. I love when you explain things like that and kind of paint the picture. All right, so MMT has a strong base of small to mid-sized mold building shops. So can you talk a little bit about the data with regards to shop size and give us a picture of that?
Absolutely. So we've been shop size in a lot of different ways, but for simplicity, I've got it shown here as shops under 50 employees in size and shops over 100 employees in size. And this really, I think, helps to show the dichotomy that we're talking about. Maybe it's a bifurcation, but what we see typically is that in good economic times, everybody's succeeding, everybody is growing, but it tends to be that the larger shops report faster expansion than the smaller shops. And you can see that in the data. If you go back to 2015, 2016, when there's a slowdown in the economy, typically the smaller shops also have fewer levers of power. They have maybe a little less maneuverability in what they can and can't do and how they can maneuver around a difficult time. And so you'll see, for example, here, the under 50 employees number, it dropped much more below 50 than, say, for the shops over 100 employees in size. So, okay, let's bring it forward to 2020. And right now, what we're seeing is something similar. We're seeing that the large shops, as they come out of this COVID recession, are leading the way. They're seeing a little bit greater business activity. Now, remember, we also need to keep in mind that some of this inflated reading we're seeing here, this upward reading, is a function of that supply chain number that we're recording. It could be that some of that large company growth is actually a function of their supply chains being more disrupted from COVID than the smaller guys. But that's only a small part of what's driving this delta between the small shops and the large shops. But what's encouraging is that, even now in the most recent months, we're seeing that smaller shops are recording some overall business activity growth, which is really encouraging because it tells us something about the shape of this recovery. The recovery has been much more V-shaped than maybe a lot of people thought it would be. There was initial hope they would be V-shaped, and I think as we got into the middle of 2020, we thought maybe this would be more of a prolonged recovery. They would take a lot longer, but from our data, what we're seeing is that shops big and small are both reporting expanding activity growth, which is really great. And we're encouraged to see that, especially, this early, I think, into such a deep and profound recession. The numbers that we saw back in March and April and May were just record-breaking in all sorts of undesired ways.
Exactly.
But the comeback has been really encouraging. So by size, we're seeing everybody is reporting expansionary activity. It's just that the larger firms are seeing, I think, a much stronger recovery early on right now, which, again, looking back to historical data, that's not unusual. Again, go back to early 2014 or go to 2017. You can see in all of those cases where we had an expansionary period, the larger firms tended to ramp up their business activity a little sooner than the smaller shops.
Now, I know you've noted that, or have said before, that you've noticed suppliers, and I agree with you, have found new ways of operating under the shadow of COVID. So elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, if we look at supplier deliveries, where is it? Okay, I'm going to just start here. So again, Christina, if I back up a slide and we look at that supplier deliveries reading line, what you see is, of course, we saw peak disruption back in February and March. And then what we saw after that was that despite the fact that there was all this disruption still occurring, we saw shops finding ways to deal with the disruption. And so we saw that supplier deliveries reading start to come down. And that was really encouraging. Again, like I said, if you look at the very latest months, you'll see that there's a small uptick. Again, I think that has to do with seasonality. And we're just coming into the holiday season, and everything is just going to move a little bit slower. Those trucks are just going to be overwhelmed, like they are every fourth quarter now.
Right.
But like I was saying in those articles, we've seen some really encouraging numbers. The worst thing that you could have seen probably was that supplier deliveries would become elevated, and then they would stay at that 60+ level. And that would be really discouraging. But what we saw rather was that supplier deliveries did start to improve a little bit in that second and third quarter of 2020. And that's what you want to see, is you want to see firms figuring out solutions to their problems. And that's sure enough what they were doing.
Yeah, everyone's had to get very creative. I mean, so many lessons to be learned this year. I mean, that's what I look at 2020 as, the year of not only like the great accelerator pushing change that was going to happen anyway, but it's really forced companies to look at things differently and get creative. So, I mean, and I see that you see that too. All right. So lastly, I know you are a proponent of diversification, just like me. So any important end market trends or data to share, especially with respect to some of the industries that are particularly important to the MoldMaking Technology audience, such as automotive, medical, and consumer packaging?
a great example of why diversification can be so important to every manufacturer. It doesn't matter if you're a mold maker or if you're a metal cutting job shop or somebody else. Diversification has been huge. We've seen again and again how firms that diversify can find ways to help level set their production when they're diversified, because they can work with the different end markets, because every end market's timing is a little bit different. And we can see here, even in 2020, automotive has rebounded much faster than I think anybody expected. Medical, that's an obvious choice in a pandemic recession. Everybody would want to be there. Custom processors have seen a lot of activity this year. They've rebounded very quickly. Part of that is because of the need for single-use plastics, for example. As much as a lot of people try to get away from it, there are times where a single-use product is just the right way to go. We've seen electronics. We've seen, as more people, just as you and I are doing it now, we're using more computers, more cameras, a lot more electronics goods. So we've seen that market rebound very nicely as well. And manufacturers are finding ways to, meet those needs. There are a couple of markets that haven't done as well, some of the more classic metalworking markets. So metal cutting job shops and especially machinery and equipment, those markets are taking a lot longer to recover. And we haven't quite seen a recovery there yet. They continue to report slowing contraction in total business activity. But of course, eventually they'll recover. If a reader, of course, looks at this data, I know that it's a little bit like a plate of spaghetti here, but the simple fact is that the volatility that you're seeing and all of these lines are crossing each other all the time. And the reason for that, again, I want to emphasize that's because each of these markets has its own unique dynamics. The timing of which markets are up and down, it's not completely uniform. Sometimes it's not even close to that. And so having your chips essentially spread across a series of different end markets can be really helpful, because again, when one market is down, maybe another one of the markets you serve is up, and you can modify your production so that you can help level set things and maintain efficiencies. You can keep your people busy, and that's so important. So that's
such a great formula.
That's why we're always talking about the importance of diversification.
And that goes right along with your own investment portfolio, right? Diversification is key, right? A little bit of a lot of things, more than all your eggs in one basket. But it's amazing how often you don't see that happen. So thank you for that. So data is only as good as the people that are providing that data. So can you remind people how they can participate in this survey data and how best to access data that Gardner Intelligence puts out there regularly?
Absolutely. So Christina, the people who are able to participate in the MMT survey have to be MMT readers first. We have to know that you exist. So I'm thrilled that I get to do these videos with you, and I'm thrilled that anyone who has a computer connection can benefit from the data that we're bringing to market, to the public. But if you're not an MMT reader, then we can't send you the survey. So please sign up for the MMT magazine. And then get in touch with us. If you want to reach out to myself directly, you can. You can always go to gardnerintelligence.com. And lastly, Christina, along the same lines, I also want to say thank you to all of your readers who do participate. I'm sure that we're all very busy. Sometimes finding an extra few minutes to respond to a monthly survey might seem like it's not a big deal, and it's easy enough to just dismiss those emails, but they're so important because they allow all of us to really know what's going on. It's hard, I think, to find good, high quality data on the manufacturing space on a month-to-month basis. So your readers are making that possible, and we're very, very appreciative for that. So please, when you see those, GBI emails, please respond to them.
Yeah, fill them out. All right, Michael, thank you so much for your time. And for everybody watching out there, remember, for everything mold making, visit MoldMakingTechnology.com. Stay safe and healthy, and more importantly, stay informed and stay inspired. A little sneak peek, everyone, at what our chief economist reads in his personal time.
Well, yeah, sometimes I read them, sometimes I just use them to prop up my computer. So you can see here, statistical analysis. This is easy reading. Let's see here. This is a little more exciting. There's your seasonal adjustment with the X11 method. This is very important when we want to make sure that we understand how things are moving with the exclusion of cycles. There you go, the new introduction to
Wow.
multiple time series. Yes, these make
I love this
fantastic-
because you are proving why we have you and why you're so key to this data that we provide mold manufacturers, right? Because
right.
you are someone that reads books like this.
Well, you know, and the other thing too is that this is a lot better than throwing darts. My dartboard doesn't work as well as some of these books. So